These are just a few of the ancient laws from the biblical book of Leviticus. For most people, this book is a source of serious controversy. It's the part of the Bible that even many devout believers tend to quietly skip over. It just feels strange, archaic, and totally irrelevant. But what if we've been missing the point all along? What if this ancient rulebook actually holds a surprisingly relevant message about justice, community, and what it means to live a good life today? What if buried beneath all the rules about skin diseases and animal sacrifices is a profound vision for a better world? We're going to investigate the historical and theological meaning behind these laws to figure out what they truly meant and what they might still have to say to us now. It's time to decode Leviticus. To understand Leviticus, you have to ask a simple question. Why does this book even exist? To a modern reader, it can seem like a random list of do's and don'ts dropped from the sky with no explanation. To find the answer, we have to go back in time to somewhere around the 15th century BCE. Imagine a massive group of people, hundreds of thousands of them, who have just been freed from 400 years of slavery in Egypt. They aren't a nation. They're a traumatized, disorganized collection of families wandering in the Sinai desert. For generations, all they've known is the culture, religion, and social hierarchy of their Egyptian masters. Now they're free, but they're also completely adrift. They have no constitution, no legal system, and no shared identity beyond their collective trauma and a promise from the God who liberated them. This is the exact moment Leviticus enters the story. The entire book is set at the foot of Mount Sinai, where this new nation is camped. It's not just a rule book, it's a blueprint for building a new society from the ground up. Think of it as a mix of a constitution, a public health manual, and a religious charter, all in one. It was given to a specific people at a specific time to answer a very specific question. How do we, a nation of former slaves, live together in a way that is totally different from the brutal empire we just left? The central answer Leviticus gives can be summed up in one powerful, recurring idea: holiness. The book famously commands, "Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." Now, our modern idea of holy often brings to mind moral perfection or a kind of quiet piety. But in the original Hebrew, the core idea of holiness, kadosh, means to be set apart or distinct. God was calling this new nation to be fundamentally different in their worship, their social structure, and their ethics. This idea of being set apart is the master key to unlocking the whole book. It's the logic behind all the rules that seem so strange to us. The laws were designed to create a new and distinct culture, one organized not around the power of a pharaoh, but around the presence of a holy God. To make this abstract idea tangible, Leviticus uses the powerful concepts of purity and boundaries. Much of the book is dedicated to distinguishing between what is clean and unclean. This isn't about good versus evil. An unclean person wasn't necessarily a sinner. Instead, these were physical, tangible categories meant to create a map for daily living and symbolize a deeper spiritual reality. The laws created boundaries in everyday life, in food, health, and relationships that constantly reminded the Israelites that they were a people defined by divine order, not chaos, and by their unique relationship with God. These physical boundaries were a symbol of the social and spiritual boundaries that would make them a distinct and holy people. Okay, that context is helpful. The Israelites needed a societal blueprint, and the laws were about being set apart. But that doesn't immediately explain why. They couldn't eat a lobster roll, or wear a cotton polyester blend. To really get this ancient text, we have to tackle some of the so-called weird laws head-on. Let's start with the dietary laws in Leviticus 11. No pork, no shellfish, no vultures. From our perspective, it seems random, but from the ancient Israelite worldview, it was all about symbolic order. Clean land animals were those that had two specific traits: a completely split hoof, and they chewed the cud. Think cows, sheep, and goats. These animals fit a neat, orderly pattern. Animals that had only one of those traits, like pigs, which have a split hoof but don't chew the cud, broke the pattern. They didn't fit the ideal system. The same logic applied in the water. Clean fish had to have both fins and scales. Creatures like shrimp or crabs, which crawl on the sea floor, were outside that orderly classification and therefore considered unclean. This wasn't about God having strange culinary tastes. It was a daily, tangible reminder, 3 times a day, at every meal, that the Israelites were a people committed to God's order in a disordered world. Every food choice was an act of cultural and religious identity. What about that infamous ban on wearing clothes of mixed fabrics, like wool and linen together? Again, context is key. This wasn't about some ancient fashion police. For one, some scholars point out that the garments worn by pagan priests in surrounding cultures were often made of mixed fibers, so this law was a direct command not to look like them. It was another way to be set apart. It also reflects that same symbolic principle of keeping categories distinct. Wool comes from an animal, and linen comes from a plant. The law served as a physical symbol of a spiritual commitment to maintain the boundaries God had established in creation. Then there are the health and disease laws, which can feel especially harsh. Leviticus 13 and 14 detail procedures for identifying and quarantining people with contagious skin diseases, and even for dealing with mildew in a house. But if we look closer, we see something remarkable. In these chapters, the priests act less like spiritual judges and more like public health officers. They were tasked with diagnosing communicable conditions to protect the health of the entire community. The laws about scraping or removing parts of a house with mildew, rather than just abandoning it, show a practical concern for preserving resources in what was essentially a migrant society. These weren't just about spiritual purity. They were ancient forms of community hygiene, revealing a God concerned with the physical, day-to-day well-being of the people. For many modern readers, the biggest barrier to Leviticus is the constant, graphic depiction of animal sacrifice. It feels primitive, violent, and deeply unsettling. What kind of God would demand something like this? To get it, we have to take off our modern glasses. In the ancient world, animal sacrifice was the universal language of worship. It wasn't unique to Israel. It's how nearly all cultures interacted with the divine. What was unique in Israel was its meaning. The sacrificial system wasn't about appeasing an angry, bloodthirsty God. It was a structured, symbolic system for dealing with sin and ritual impurity, offering a tangible way to show repentance and restore a broken relationship with God. When an Israelite sinned, they created a rupture in the community and in their relationship with God. The sacrifice of an animal, a valuable part of one's own flock, represented the seriousness of that rupture, a powerful acknowledgement that sin leads to death. But at the same time, the system provided a concrete, God-given path back to wholeness. It was a constant reminder that while sin was serious, forgiveness and restoration were always possible. This whole system reached its climax once a year, on a day called Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. On this day, the high priest would perform a series of rituals to atone for the sins of the entire nation. The most famous ritual involved 2 goats. One goat was sacrificed as a sin offering. The second, known as the scapegoat, was brought before the priest, who would lay his hands on its head and confess all the sins of Israel. Then that goat was led far out into the wilderness, symbolically carrying away the sins of the community, never to return. It's a profound image. It's a picture of sin and guilt being completely and utterly removed, sent away to a place where they no longer have power. It showed that God's ultimate desire wasn't punishment, but purification and a renewed relationship. The system was a constant visual aid, demonstrating the seriousness of sin and the even greater reality of God's grace. So if these laws were so important, why don't Christians follow most of them today? Why aren't we avoiding shrimp and offering sacrifices? To answer that, it's helpful to understand how the laws themselves are often categorized. For centuries, scholars have found it useful to group the 613 laws of the Old Testament into 3 main, man-made categories: moral, civil, and ceremonial. This framework isn't in the Bible itself, but it's a valuable lens for making sense of them. First, the moral laws. These are timeless commands that are understood to reflect God's unchanging character. They deal with universal principles of right and wrong, like the prohibitions against murder and theft, and the command to love your neighbor. These are seen as binding for all people at all times. Second, the civil laws. These were the laws governing the nation of Israel as a specific political state in a particular historical moment. They were Israel's legal code, covering things like property rights and the justice system. While they contain timeless principles of justice, their specific applications were for that ancient society. Third, the ceremonial laws. This category includes all the rules about the sacrificial system, the priesthood, the purity codes, and the dietary restrictions. Their purpose was to teach the Israelites about holiness and to point forward to something greater. The crucial shift in Christian theology is the belief that with the coming of Jesus Christ, the purpose of these laws fundamentally changed. Christians believe that the civil and ceremonial laws, which were tied to the nation of Israel and its temple worship, are no longer binding because their function has been fulfilled. The moral law, however, remains because it's rooted in God's eternal nature. This brings us to the big question: how does this ancient book connect to our lives? And why is it still at the center of so many modern debates? The answer lies in how Jesus himself related to the law. In the New Testament, Jesus says he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. He didn't just get rid of it, he brought its ultimate purpose to its intended conclusion. He is presented as the final and perfect sacrifice for sin, making the temple's sacrificial system obsolete. He is the ultimate high priest. He embodies the perfect holiness that the purity laws were pointing toward. In Christian belief, the elaborate system of rituals in Leviticus was like a signpost, and Jesus is the destination it was pointing to all along. This is why Christians don't follow the ceremonial laws. To go back to sacrificing animals would be like studying the signposts after you've already arrived. But what about the controversial verses, particularly those cited in debates about gender role ethics? Leviticus contains 2 verses that prohibit male same-gender acts. These are often used as definitive proof texts. However, understanding them requires the same careful, contextual lens we've used for everything else. A number of scholars argue these prohibitions are found in a section of the book that is overwhelmingly concerned with distinguishing Israel from the idolatrous and exploitative practices of surrounding cultures. Some of these pagan cultures incorporated cultic shrine prostitution, both male and female, into their religious rituals. From this perspective, the prohibitions in Leviticus can be understood as a rejection of those specific pagan practices, rather than a blanket condemnation of all same-gender relationships, as we might understand them today. It's also important to recognize that the ancient world did not have a widespread social or legal concept of a consensual, monogamous, same-gender partnership. While this scholarly interpretation doesn't resolve the debate for everyone, it demonstrates that applying these ancient verses uncritically to modern life is problematic and often ignores their specific historical and cultural context. And maybe most importantly, focusing only on these few verses means we risk missing the revolutionary heart of Leviticus. The very same holiness code is filled with some of the most radical social justice ethics in the ancient world. Leviticus commands farmers not to harvest the edges of their fields, but to leave the gleanings for the poor and the immigrant. It commands employers to pay their laborers on the same day they work. It contains laws protecting the disabled, demanding honesty in business with just balances and just weights, and commanding respect for the elderly. And then, tucked away in chapter 19, is the verse Jesus himself would later call the second greatest commandment: "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." That timeless, world-changing ethic doesn't come from a sermon in the New Testament. It comes from the heart of Leviticus. The book even goes a step further, commanding the Israelites to love the foreigner living among them, reminding them, "For you lived as foreigners in the land of Egypt." It was a radical command for empathy-based justice. So when we pull back and look at the whole picture, Leviticus is transformed. The book that once seemed like a bizarre collection of rules reveals itself to be a profound and challenging vision for a community. It's a story of a God who isn't distant and abstract, but is intensely interested in every part of human life. From our worship to our work, from our food to our finances. We started with how weird Leviticus feels, but we've uncovered a deep logic running beneath the surface. We found a blueprint for a new nation, founded on the idea of being set apart. We decoded strange laws and found they were tangible symbols of a commitment to God's order and holiness. We saw how the entire sacrificial system points toward a deep human need for atonement and grace. Ultimately, the enduring legacy of Leviticus isn't in its rules about shellfish or fabrics. It's found in its radical call to create a just and compassionate society. It challenges us to imagine a world where the poor are cared for, where immigrants are treated with love, where business is honest, and where we truly love our neighbors as ourselves. And that is a message that is anything but outdated. What's the most surprising thing you learned about this ancient book? Let me know in the comments below. If this video helped you see this ancient text in a new light, consider subscribing and liking the video so more people can discover this conversation.